Beginning at the end of the second decade of the 17th century A.D., there were, again, as in the first decade of the preceding century, three major works of literature published that would serve to plot a course for much of popular philosophical thinking over the subsequent century, and possibly even for time immemorial beyond that. By the end of the 17th century, the 1687 publication of the work Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy by Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, had irrevocably altered the history of our species, establishing the stylistic foundation for all subsequent schools of material science that followed. However, again, without the publication of these three works earlier in that century, Newton's own calculations would not have been fathomed then, and our present history would look drastically different from how it appears to us now. In 1619 A.D., Johann Kepler, 1571 to 1630, published Harmonices Mundi, the harmony of the world, in which he proposed the distance between planetary orbits may be derived using a ratio like that determining musical harmonics, and in 1621 published a second edition of his older work, originally published at Tübingen in 1596, the year René Descartes was born, entitled Mysterium Cosmographicum, the Cosmic Mystery, in which he proposed the distance relationships between the 6 planets known at that time could be understood in terms of the 5 Platonic solids enclosed within a sphere that represented the orbit of Saturn. In both these works, Kepler used complex calculus and geometries that have proven to differ from observable conditions in reality, but which nevertheless warrant great scrutiny and study, being that they inspired the shortly subsequent work, the Principia, or Principles of Isaac Newton, which contained even more mathematically accurate models accounting for real-world observations. It may be overlooked sometimes that without the successful publications and lack of persecution by the Vatican papacy of Johann Kepler, there would likely not have been able to have been the 1687 work Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy by Sir Isaac Newton. It was almost as though, by attempting to propose a perfect or ideal model for the solar system's orbits, Kepler's work proved a tipping point, after which subsequent researchers who wished to adhere more acutely to observational data only could proceed to do so with less fear of reprisal from Rome. In 1627 A.D., published posthumously to his passing by 1 year, the work by Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, appeared as a work of the same genre as Thomas More's Utopia of 1516 and Johann Valentin Andre's Christianopolis of 1619. Bacon's use of More's utopian model was so recognizable that almost a century later, English satirist Jonathan Swift, 1667 to 1745, parodied it in Book 3 of his 1726 work, amended 1735, Gulliver's Travels. While the deadpan ironic Swiftian writing style in Gulliver's may make the topic more approachable for children, it remains nevertheless an important idea to consider, and an innately Rosicrucian ideal project. If you could design your own model for a perfect society, and build it from the ground up, what would it be like? What values would you impose? And which would you relax or remove? Which replace? And with what others? Creating a utopia is a fascinating thought experiment that would never have become possible for authors such as Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, let alone Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, to explore were it not for the original ideas of Thomas More. 1478 to 1535. Being inspired into activity, possibly, it is very likely, by the R.C. manifestos, Francis Bacon was seen as the founder of modern empiricism, and this was juxtaposed in the popular mindset at that time by the rationalism of French philosopher René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. In 1637 AD, René Descartes published Discours de la méthode, the Discourse on the Method, in French, and in 1641, Meditations on First Philosophy. As a young man traveling across Europe, Descartes had been caught up into the cause of the HRE and had fought at the Battle of the White Mountain against Protestant Bohemian rebels. Following this, he had secluded himself away in Germany and proceeded to produce his magnum opuses, the Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy. However, when he returned to France and published his works, he met a very surprised audience of his old friends, who explained to him that there were rumors circulating about Descartes saying he had joined the Rosicrucians. Descartes denied it on the grounds of empirical evidence, ironically, by pointing out that if he belonged to that true and invisible order, how could anyone see him? Descartes' own philosophy laid the foundation for 17th century continental rationalism, later advocated by Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, and Gottfried Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, and opposed by the empiricist school of thought, consisting of Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, John Locke, 1632 to 1704, George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, and David Hume, 1711 to 1776. Empiricism states that knowledge comes only or primarily from sensory experience, but rationalism is defined as a methodology or a theory in which the criterion of the truth is not sensory but intellectual and deductive. In short, Cartesian doubt was little more than dressed-up solipsism, while Baconian method was little more than pirate's materialism. By this point, both extremes were far from the course charted for them by the papacy. Perhaps a point that is sometimes missed also is that both rationalism and empiricism sought to attain truth, albeit by using only either first inductive or first deductive reasoning, respectively. Had they been able to cooperate rather than compete, perhaps more truths would be known by now.